Greetings, everyone, and thank you for being here for the second session of Foundations of Economic Thought, an open online course offered by the Penn Initiative for the Study of Markets at the University of Pennsylvania. So we're glad to have you here as we continue exploring the ideas and thinkers that have shaped economic thought through the centuries. A quick reminder about the logistics. The session will run for 90 minutes. The first 60 to 75 will be devoted to the lecture, followed by 90 to 30 of a live Q&A. So you're encouraged to submit any question at any point using some prompt function. So we will address them collectively at the end of the session. This session and the next one will be devoted to Adam Smith, often referred to as the father of modern economics. We will examine his key contributions to our understanding of markets, trade, economic growth, and society overall. Today's lecture is presented by Jacob Hall. He is the incoming assistant professor at the Salmon Chase Center for Civics, Culture, and Society at The Ohio State University. And for the last 2 years, he has been the John and Daria Barry postdoctoral fellow here at the Penn Initiative for the Study of Markets. So let's start. Welcome, Jacob, please.
Great. Thank you, Fernando. Let me share screen. Cool. You see that? Yeah? Cool. Awesome. All right. So I have what I think is the impossible task of doing an hour on the great Adam Smith and the Scottish Enlightenment. So we'll just kind of hop right in. Oh, come on. Let me move on. Okay. So a little bit of background on the Scottish Enlightenment. 18th, just to paint you a picture of 18th century Scotland. Small geographically, relatively poor, and recently unified with England in the 1707 Act of Union. So there's kind of a lot of political stirring going on of how do we deal with being a unified country in this kind of new, increasingly globalized world. At the same time of sort of being small and poor, like up in the Highlands, there's a rapid expansion of universities in the south. Edinburgh, Glasgow, St. Andrews, and Aberdeen are all flourishing. These places are kind of the place to be. Cambridge and Oxford are increasingly becoming a place where rich kids get their education, find friends and then get a job. But the intellectual hub is increasingly in the south of Scotland. Another kind of key element of the Scottish Enlightenment is these clubs and societies, which are sort of popping up, and they sort of play a central role. You can think of them as kind of reading groups plus debate clubs plus friends to get a beer with, and maybe stir some things up. There's the Select Society in 1754, which is a sort of debating club in Edinburgh. Its members include Hume and Smith. It publishes the short-lived Edinburgh Review, with 2 editions, which Smith contributed some pretty good book reviews. So it's worth kind of Googling that and finding that if you can. Another one is the Poker Club, just to give you a sense of what these guys are up to. Formerly the Militia Club, which supported the Scottish militia reform. The goal is to kind of stir up public debate about forming a militia. This is kind of in the context of the Act of Union and questions about the legitimacy of the king. I hate that it doesn't let me do that. Okay. So there's a lot of thinkers in the Scottish Enlightenment. We're going to kind of talk about one, and I'm going to kind of sprinkle these other guys in throughout the lecture. So Francis Hutcheson, Lord Keynes, David Hume, William Robertson, Adam Smith, Ferguson, James Hutton, Reed, Miller, Stewart. These guys are either sort of either influencers on Smith or influenced by Smith. Smith is kind of really at the heart of the Scottish Enlightenment in some sense. I encourage you, I'm not going to talk about every single one of these, but to Google, prompt ChatGPT, go figure out more about them. And of course, read them. You can find PDFs or some pretty decently priced books from these guys at libertyfund.org. It's kind of worth consulting and sort of diving into this. We're going to kind of start with Smith, and then hopefully you'll kind of go on and sort of explore these others. One sort of big background thing that's worth emphasizing here in the beginning of the lecture is mercantilism. What is mercantilism? So it's a sort of phase in the history of economic policy as well as a sort of body of thought, but it's really more of a phase of policy rather than like a kind of tight, coherent, analytical body of thought. It sort of comes out of medieval economic thought, and by the time of the 16th century, it's basically common to all European countries. Sort of has its history from the 16th to the 18th century. Some sort of core aspects of mercantilism, just to kind of give you a flavor of what this economic policy is one, economic policy is designed to promote unification of the state. This makes sense, right? The state is sort of coming out of the feudal world in the 16th century. First thing to do is, well, maybe we should sort of unify the state economically in terms of economic power. Second is sort of related. Economic policy is designed to increase the power of the state. All economic activity is sort of subservient to that end. Three, economic policy is designed to promote the wealth of the state through systematic protection of domestic producers. So this is the kind of key point here. And then fourth, a system of monetary policy, which sought to increase the quantity of money and precious metals within a country. So the kind of big idea here is that the goal of the mercantilist system is to promote the unification of the state, increase its power via domestic protection of its producers and the sort of hoarding of specie and sort of particular precious metals. Interestingly, many mercantilists, from what I understand, were kind of against state interventions in domestic markets, really except monopolies. These aren't like sort of hyper interventionists, but they are sort of concerned about the country on sort of the what we might call the global scale. All of this is sort of nicely put together in Ely Heckscher's Mercantilism, sort of a 2-volume set that covers both what we would think of as economic history or political history, as well as history of thought. It's really recommended. It's very, very difficult to get your hands on if you want a physical copy. I was kind of poking around before. I saw $1,000, $800. But if you poke around, you could pretty easily find a PDF somewhere. Or your local library if you're at a university. Okay, so with that kind of background, let's get to the main character of the story. This is Adam Smith, born in 1723 in Kirkcaldy, Scotland. Sort of lived a nice, decently long life. Died in 1790 in Edinburgh. He studied at Glasgow and Oxford. Again, a kind of close friend of David Hume, a student of Francis Hutcheson, sort of tied in pretty deeply to the network of the Scottish Enlightenment. He was a sort of professor of moral philosophy at Glasgow, 51 to 64. So he kind of was at the pinnacle of his career. In 59, he writes his first great book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. He sort of does a tour of Europe with the Duke of Buccleuch in 1764, spending 3 years in France as his tutor. This Duke of Buccleuch at the time would have been 18, so it's kind of funny to imagine Smith and the Duke kind of prancing around Europe and France, perhaps getting into trouble and Smith bailing him out. And then he comes back and writes the sort of most famous book that we know today, The Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations in 1776. From what I understand, this picture is the only picture or engraving made during Smith's lifetime. This was made by James Tassie. It's difficult to determine if this is an accurate representation of what he actually looked like. It's not photo, it's an engraving, so I imagine they made him look a little bit better. But this is a kind of template by which all pictures of Smith that you see on the internet kind of sort of build from. Smith is, unlike a lot of philosophers, but I suppose like a lot of great philosophers, has adoring fans throughout, both his lifetime and today. This is the Adam Smith Review. It's published annually. Very few philosophers and even fewer economists have entire journals sort of dedicated to kind of working out of their thought. Adam Smith is one of them. It's worth perusing the sort of Adam Smith Review just to get a sense of what sort of modern economists and thinkers, scholars think about Adam Smith, but also look through the footnotes and the works cited, and you kind of get some classic takes on Smith as well. Okay, so it's worth pausing here for a second. These are his major works. First is The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and the second is The Wealth of Nations. There are more. There's lectures on jurisprudence, and there's some essays on the history of astronomy and sort of other elements of history and sort of book reviews and musings. Everything else, interestingly, was thrown into the fire after his death. So what we lost, we do not know, but what we have is pretty great. So I don't know what Professor Dan Klein is going to be talking about, but having known him for a long time, he'll probably cover a lot of the third moral sentiments. So most of today is going to be about the wealth of nations, given the sort of economic bent of this webinar. I'm going to try to cover the kind of high points of the wealth of nations. We could spend an entire semester, really an entire lifetime, kind of grappling with and walking through the wealth of nations. So I'm going to give you the high points and kind of give you the main key threads. If you're following along at home, sort of looking at the quotes that I'm going to provide later on, I abbreviate theory of moral sentiments as TMS and the wealth of nations as WN. The sort of WN 456.9 refers to page 456, paragraph 9. So if you're kind of looking back at these lectures and you want to go to the text, this is kind of the schematic here. So again, I'm not going to really cover TMS, but I want to give you some sense that this pair, these siblings, as it were, are kind of part of a larger system of thought that kind of Smith is sort of developing and working out. So the wealth of nations is really a kind of annex of TMS. And so in TMS, at the very end of TMS, Smith says, I shall, in another discourse, the wealth of nations, endeavor to give an account of the general principles of law and government and of the different revolutions of society, not only in which concerns justice, but in what concerns police, revenue, and arms, police being policy, and whatever else is the object of law. So Smith finishes the TMS, publishes it, keeps kind of editing it, but hints that he's going to do this other great big work. And so the Wealth of Nations is sort of that great big work. More abstractly, Wealth of Nations nicely links to TMS. In TMS, Smith lays out 4 sources of moral approval. So when we kind of consider someone's actions, right? If I consider my friend Marcus's actions, I consider, 1, sympathy with the agent's motives and intentions. Like, what was Marcus thinking when he did that thing? I enter into the gratitude or resentment with those affected, right? The person that maybe Marcus was a little short with at the grocery store or something. I kind of enter into how they might feel about it. Third, the alignment of the sort of agent's conduct with established rules and expectations, right? What do we think about this as a kind of rule, how we live our lives? And 4, the agent's actions is making a part of the system of behavior, which tends to promote the happiness either of the individual or of the society. This is a kind of global view. And Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, is sort of developing his readers' appreciation for matters such as economic policy that relate to the system of behavior. But how do we think about kind of justice of, say, the mercantilist system? Is kind of all in sort of the source 4. So here's Wealth of Nations from 30,000 feet. There's many different takes on how to approach this. One I want to highlight is this letter from Adam Smith to Andreas Holt in 1780. He says, he kind of characterizes the Wealth of Nations as the violent attack I had made upon the whole commercial system of Britain. And you can kind of read the entire book as sort of propagating that theme. Here's the kind of breakdown of the Wealth of Nations 5 books. These are kind of loose versions of the chapter headings. Of the causes of improvement in the productive powers of labor, kind of the division of labor. Of the nature, accumulation, and employment of stock. Book 3, economic history from the fall of Rome to his day. 4 is like this full violent attack of mercantilist policies, like kind of explicitly. And 5 is an articulation of the proper duties and workings of the state. So again, this is sort of one through line of the Wealth of Nations, is this violent attack against mercantilism. There are other through lines that we could talk about, bring it up in the Q&A. One is a sort of development of his system of natural liberty. Another is maybe a kind of working out of the mechanisms and appreciation for the invisible hand. Those kind of relate, but there's a kind of other through line. So before getting into Smith and what he's talking about and his violent attack, it's worth remembering and sort of emphasizing that Smith lived in a polity that was broadly stable. By broadly stable, I don't mean there was no political jockeying or there was no potential warfare. I mean, it was not in danger of crumbling into a kind of feudal anarchy as the 13th century was, right? There's some sense of the government. There's some sense of like what the government does and some sense of policy that they can put in place or not. Thus, his economic and political discussions sort of assume this stable polity. There's a thing, the state, that we can talk about that can do things or not do things. This is true for Hume and other thinkers in the Scottish Enlightenment as well. It's not so true for Hobbes, Locke, Grotius, Pufendorf, and sort of other predecessors. So in some real sense, we sort of are better able to enter into the sentiments and ideas of Smith and Hume and the Scottish Enlightenment better than Locke and Grotius, because our world is sort of fundamentally similar to theirs, even if on the surface it's quite different. So Smith starts the book, this is the opening line of The Wealth of Nations, with the greatest improvement in the productive powers of labor and the greater part of the skill, dexterity, and judgment with which it anywhere directed or applied seem to have been the effects of the division of labor. And so this is what I think is like one major key idea of Smith that sort of he starts the book with. He gets into this example of the pin factory to kind of sort of show what he's talking about. You can kind of imagine these guys are putting pins together, and it's a sort of example of the productivity gains that come from the division of labor. So you can sort of put yourself in this image here. It's all up to you to make pins, right? It's kind of a long, drawn out process. You have to do 18 different steps. You're not really going to be very productive. You're going to get maybe 20 or 30 done in that day. But if we all kind of get together, like here all on this webinar, and we do one individual little step, we sort of break it down, then I can specialize on my one little step, right? The drawing of the wire, not cutting the wire, but just the drawing of the wire out. Then we can sort of work together and be much more productive. Think just like the kind of modern assembly line, as it were. Smith ascribes this increase in productivity to like three kind of key things: increased dexterity from repetition, right? I just get better at sort of drawing the wire out, or I get better at cutting the wire in the perfect way, very fast at it. The time saved from not switching tasks. This is like kind of a funny one. Like sauntering around or like going from task 1 to task 2. I kind of like go a little slow on the walk, or I have to kind of walk all the way across the room to do it. And 3, the invention and use of machines, which I kind of think he like totally buries the lead on this. Like the invention and use of machines seems to be like the most important one, and it's the kind of driver of this sort of tinkering revolution. But he kind of puts it in with the others. I don't know why. Maybe there's something there, but this guy, I always thought that was kind of funny. But with this division of labor, 10 men can produce 48,000 pins. Rather than working alone, I can kind of make 15 or 20. Interestingly, today, we actually, like good economic historians, have done the work of sort of tracking the real price of nails, not pins, they're close enough, from 1695 to 2018. And there's been this huge dramatic decline in the real price of nails since about 1815. And they sort of most of this decline, according to them, kind of comes from what we would think of as like productivity driven by the division of labor. So it's not just the sort of thought experiment, like it is real. That pin factory, the sort of modern assembly line, as it were, that kind of us working together to put the nails of the pins together, is a metaphor for the larger kind of Catton order that produces the day laborer's woolen coat. So like the pin factory, like the division of labor in the pin factory, is like the kind of larger division of labor and sort of the larger economy. So Smith picks up this sort of object, the day laborer's woolen coat. This is not a piece of luxury. It's a day laborer's coat. It's a kind of old, maybe worn out, probably fairly cheap garment. And it is, yes, sort of a cheaper garment, but it too is the produce of a joint labor of a great multitude of workmen. Right? It's not just these luxury items that are sort of coming from everywhere. It's even this sort of kind of dingy coat. He does this like great spelling out of like all of these great multitudes, right? The shepherd, the spinner, the weaver, the dyer. Like these are the guys like actually making the coat, but they rely on tools, shears, looms, dye vats, dyes themselves. But where do they get those? Well, there's miners and smelters who produce the tools and sort of produce the dyes, and it's the shipbuilders and merchants who transport the material, the inputs, the outputs. So like this sort of pin factory where we're all in the same firm, as it were, this division of labor is sort of global in scale. And it's really the market that coordinates these vast networks of specialized labor without centralized planning. It's important to note here that this is not just like an analytic or philosophizing for Smith. Like he really does seem to marvel at this sort of miracle of this larger concatenate order, which produces the woolen coat. Like he uses 2 exclamation marks in a row, which Smith does not often do. So he sort of marvels at it. If this sounds familiar, this is what Milton Friedman was doing, except with this pencil. It's worth, I don't link it in this talk, but it's worth sort of Googling or going to YouTube, Milton Friedman pencil. It's kind of the same idea, right? This simple pencil is developed through this larger concatenate order. So there's a kind of a long history of using these sort of simple objects to sort of nicely illustrate the invisible hand. There's also this other famous line, I think this is maybe chapter 2. The division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. The process that produces this great woolen coat is limited by the extent of the market. That extent of the market is limited by one element is transport costs, right? It's just more difficult to sort of get the good up the river, and so we're not able to kind of communicate and trade with them. Interestingly, Smith goes on to argue that the location and navigability of seas and rivers sort of partly explains the comparative poverty of inland Africa and Asia, rather than their kind of innate inferiority. So perhaps stepping away from thinkers before him, he's sort of emphasizing these like economic elements that drive the division of labor and drive sort of comparative development. It's not anything about the Africans or the Asians. It's like that the seas and the rivers are like in the wrong location, which increase transport costs, which then sort of limit the extent of the market, which then limit economic growth. So this is like kind of core idea of Smith. Kind of moving through the book, Smith then takes up the theory of value. The reason I think he does that and kind of putting these slides together and reflecting on why is Smith laying the book out as he is, the mercantilists are sort of arguing that, well, the value of the nation or of wealth kind of comes from bullion and like gold. And so he kind of has to sort of articulate a kind of alternative theory of, well, what makes things valuable. But he's also kind of grappling with these sort of deeper philosophical and economic questions that the ancients and the medievals kind of gave him. So Smith distinguishes between 2 kinds of value. There's value in use, which is like the kind of utility of an object, the use of an object, and value in exchange, what it kind of command in the market. His class, like sort of famously, gives rise to the diamond water paradox. The idea is, well, water is so useful, right? It's like its value and use is so high, but kind of fetches a relatively small price on the market. But diamonds seem sort of worthless, like right? They are nice to help like decorate things, but they command such a high price. Like, why this paradox? These classical economists, including Smith, like don't really fully resolve this paradox. It's not until sort of the marginalist revolution that we kind of crack this question. But Smith sort of turns to explaining how exchange value is determined in commercial societies and why relative prices change over time. So it's not a total punting of this, but he sort of emphasizes other elements. So to kind of play out Smith's theory of value. He kind of has I emphasize seeming labor theory of value, just because I'm going to sort of build out on this. So he says the value of any commodity, the person who possesses it and who means not to use or consume it himself, but to exchange it for other commodities, is equal to the quantity of labor which it enables him to purchase or command. Labor, therefore, is the real measure of the exchangeable value of all commodities. Notice he says measure and not like source. I think that's important. But Smith quickly recognizes, as perhaps you do, that the quality and productivity of labor is highly variable. I mentioned my friend Marcus earlier. Marcus is a Boy Scout. You can imagine us like sort of putting widgets together, and maybe Marcus is a little bit more dexterous than I am. And so he's a little bit faster to put the widgets together, and he kind of accumulates more at the end of the day, but he's more productive than me. So if we were just going to measure the value of the goods on like number of hours put into it, well, like that doesn't, like Marcus is like much better at that. So like kind of working that out kind of has a problem. Smith later comes around to getting to the idea in the next chapter that once society makes it out of its early and rude state, kind of think hunter-gatherers, it's not really labor alone that's adequate to explain market value because of capital and labor. Like other inputs go into the production of these goods. Right, so he says wages, profit, and rent are the three original sources of all revenue, as well as all exchangeable value. So it's not really like a labor theory of value. It's more of a cost theory of value. But in some sense, like when reading this, in 2025, kind of having gone through your typical microeconomic course, it's a bit of a muddle. But I kind of think this sort of cost theory of value underlying what Smith is saying. Immediately after this section, we're sort of moving through the book, Smith sort of begins to think about, well, productive and unproductive labor. And rather than the mercantilist saying, well, national wealth is largely a sort of product or a function of the amount of money in a society, Smith says, no, like national wealth is measured by the exchangeable value of the annual produce of land and labor of the country. It's like the things that are produced, right? This is sort of, in some sense, our sense of what we mean by national income today. But Smith considered the essence of wealth to be the production of physical goods and not really services. So he sort of distinguishes between productive labor and unproductive labor. Productive labor is the production of these tangible goods, some market value, where unproductive labor produces intangibles like services by artisans or professionals. This is a bit unfortunate and a bit of a muddle, and so why Smith sort of goes on, sort of does this. I think today we would say like, nah, that's not. Services are just as valuable and just as productive, and sort of people who do labor to produce services are just as productive through the kind of larger national wealth. Now, Eklund and Hebert in 1975, in some sense, try to like save Smith on this, which I think is sort of valiant. Suggesting his underlying point anticipates a valid distinction in modern growth theory. There's activities that raise aggregate net investment versus those that merely serve the needs of households. So it's sort of worth kind of looking up Eklund and Hebert and kind of reading what they're sort of saying on this. Okay, the other sort of big idea, I sort of see the division of labor and invisible hand is sort of much more important than these kind of other questions about value and productive versus unproductive labor. So Smith sort of famously says he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which has no part of his intention. This is probably the most famous line of Smith. This is probably the most famous line in any economics text ever. Go on the street and ask, what did Adam Smith say or do or talk about? I'm willing to bet they will utter the phrase, the invisible hand. You'll never write a better phrase. You'll never sort of make it that high. Smith wins in some sense. This is situated in the first chapter that launches into Smith's criticism of mercantilism. When he says in this, he's referring to the decision to sort of dock your goods in the home market or the foreign market. This is the only use of the term in the Wealth of Nations, and a lot of people make a big deal out of that. I would sort of downplay that as like a major insight. The book is full of invisible hand theorizing throughout, and he just uses it in this location, yes, but the book is sort of seeped through these kind of ideas. And also, like in the sentence, he says, as in many other cases. So again, it's not just this question of like this in this sort of particular aspect he's sort of articulating. This is a kind of through line through his entire thinking. And it's a kind of articulation of the power of market competition. But also, it's a tag for the comparative merit of freedom. When the state sort of gets out of the way, then the invisible hand promotes an end by which no part of his own intention. And so Smith says later, like a few sentences later, every individual, it is evident, can in his local situation judge much better than any statesman or lawgiver can do for him. So the question of, well, where do I dock my goods? It's a question, like it's up to the sort of local, the local merchant, as it were. So yeah, it's not just about sort of market forces. It's also a sort of comparative tag for freedom, and I think a good one. There are some other invisible hands. I'm not going to dig into them, but it's worth sort of telling you that they exist. It appears 3 times in his works. We just talked about the Wealth of Nations. There's also one in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, and there's another invisible hand of Jupiter in the History of Astronomy. Here are the citations if you kind of want to go on Liberty Fund and check them out. These usages are admittedly a bit of a muddle. It's not obvious what they're talking about and how these 3 different invisible hands relate to each other, but it's worth grappling and trying to reconcile these differences. I have some ideas. Other people have ideas. You can sort of look at some of the scholarship, but I'll kind of leave this up to you to kind of work out philosophically. Okay, so when we sort of think about the invisible hand, we then immediately, in our kind of micro econ class, kind of think about price theory and sort of the workings of supply and demand. Smith does not really think in terms of modern supply and demand schedules, right? Like the question of like, well, if the price was $10, how many would you buy versus how many would you buy if it was $5? It doesn't really think that way. But his understanding of what we might say market forces is pretty good. And it's quite evident, just sort of like reading the passages, you kind of really get the sense like, oh, he really kind of understands what's going on. And I think we'd be quite comfortable sort of explaining what we might now think of as shifts in supply and demand. He distinguishes between the market price, which you might think of as the interaction of supply and demand in the short run, and the natural price, which is the kind of long run cost of production. Eklund and Hebert, I kind of cribbed this from them, sort of do sort of textual analysis and try to force our modern concepts and modern curves to Smith. This sort of tracks. So the kind of idea is like supply, as it were, is this kind of natural price, and is a kind of the market price kind of equilibrates around it. So again, not really thinking in terms of these modern schedules, but you kind of get the sense by reading Smith that he can kind of work out these market forces. So if there's a famine or something, and there's less grain, then he really does have some sense that like the price is going to increase and like why that happens. One more before sort of getting into sort of the question of mercantilism. Banking is kind of always on our mind, and I kind of want to get across to you some important things you can take away from Smith that you might be interested in. So many of his contemporaries, perhaps like today, are skeptical or outright hostile to banking, as well as paper money. Smith was more positive, but cautious. He kind of likened banknotes this like highway in the sky, kind of think of a kind of lubricant. By substituting for gold and silver, these notes sort of free up specie for more productive investment. It was also sort of for patriotic reasons. He saw Scotland as a sort of pioneer in this area. Okay, so I kind of want to get to the heart of it. Book 4, sort of the most famous book of the Wealth of Nations, the kind of one most used as a kind of tool against would-be political enemies. So this is Smith's own description of mercantilism. It kind of nicely echoes Eli Heckscher. So this is kind of why I included it. It's worth quoting entirely. The two principles being established, however, that wealth consisted in gold and silver, and that those metals could be brought into a country which had no mines only by the balance of trade or by exporting to a greater value than it imported. It necessarily became the great object of political economy to diminish as much as possible the importation of foreign goods for home consumption and to increase as much as possible the exportation of the produce of domestic industry. Right? So it's the mercantilists want to diminish as much as possible the importation of foreign goods and increase as much as possible the exportation of domestic goods. It is these two great engines for enriching the country. Therefore, restraints on their policies, restraints on importation, and policies that encourage exportation. A bit of a detour down David Hume. You'll see kind of why I'm going to do this in a second. 1711 through 1776. He's sort of today famous as a great philosopher. I think the treatise of human nature. If you took a sort of intro to philosophy or took some classes in college, you probably read some parts of the treatise. But he made great contributions to economics and history, the essays on moral, political, and literary, and then his 6-volume history of England. He's an interesting fellow. During the Scottish Enlightenment, there was also a kind of rise of what we may think of as independent scholars outside of the university system. Smith was sort of the librarian for Scotland's largest library, which is the Faculty of Advocates. The reason he's here and probably not at the University of Glasgow is his open skepticism. But he was a great friend and intellectual compatriot of Adam Smith. And Smith kind of nicely calls him our most excellent and never to be forgotten friend. The reason I bring him up is because David Hume sort of revived the quantity theory of money from Locke and has a number of essays on money and the balance of trade, which Smith sort of builds off and uses. The kind of core idea here and the reason I kind of want to highlight this is to sort of attack this point about the balance of trade and the idea that money or gold flows into the country are really the most important thing that like a state can sort of foster. So Hume, sort of building from Locke and others, develops the logic behind what we now think of as the price-specie flow mechanism. So you can think if a country runs a trade deficit, like under a gold standard, then specie will flow out, which will shrink the money supply, thus causing domestic prices to fall, making its goods more competitive on the open market. As a result, exports then rise as people go to buy things from the sort of cheaper market. Imports fall, rebalancing trade. So the market equilibrates these international money flows and the balance and balances payments. The kind of core idea here is money is a veil. It's not the real economy. And Smith sort of picks up on this in his section on the attack on mercantilism. So it's worth knowing. It's also like Hume is a great writer, and so he's very understandable. And so you can kind of go to Liberty Fund, look at the essays, and read them yourself. Okay, so here's a bit of a breakdown for book 4, and this is going to kind of guide some of the rest of the discussion. Remember, there's restraints upon importation, which is the kind of first leg of the mercantilist political and policy program. And Smith takes sort of 2 tacks at this in chapter 2 and in chapter 3 of book 4. Chapter 2 covers the restraints upon the importation of such foreign goods for home consumption. This could be produced at home from whatever country they were imported. And 3 is restraints on the importation of goods of almost all kinds. And then 4, 5, 6, and 7 then turn to the other leg of mercantilism, encouragements to exportation, through drawbacks, bounties, advantageous trade treaties, and the establishment of colonies. So it's worth kind of going through some of these to kind of get some sense of how Smith is going to respond to these different mercantilist policies. right, so Smith on restraints on imports. Like, first thing is it interferes with the natural course of industry. It interferes with the invisible hand. Are politicians and sort of statesmen up to the task of kind of allocating where goods should flow? Smith says no. It misallocates resources, forces labor and capital into less productive uses. Right? Remember that kind of that quote about the local merchant sort of knowing best about how to deal with his own goods versus sort of the policymakers. Domestic sort of self-sufficiency is super costly and inefficient, and then kind of turns to larger critiques of what we now call as the balance of trade, right? That we have a trade deficit. It's a dangerous and mistaken doctrine. He even kind of picks up on these kind of, or I guess we pick up on Smith. You'll sort of read in the news that like, oh, I have a trade deficit with my barber. Well, Smith sort of says like, well, yeah, that's kind of true for the family. And so what's true, good prudent action for the family seems to be good prudent action for the state. So he sort of picks up on this idea that like trade balances are sort of a flawed doctrine. And they're not really inherently harmful. Right? Imports are paid for with exports or capital flows. And that targeting specific countries introduces arbitrary and politically motivated distortions that you don't really want to mess with. Like if we're going to sort of attack France, sort of not only sort of stirring up trouble, but it's not that these things are necessarily well thought out. They sort of can be arbitrary and politically motivated. Smith does have 3 exceptions for import restraints. So the first is when an industry is necessary for national defense. This is a kind of, I think, one of the most famous exceptions that people sort of trot out. This is true. I mean, he says this, although he doesn't deny the costs. Like he's not saying there's no cost to protecting an industry for national defense. It has all of the costs that he sort of has articulated already. And this sort of famous line, as defense, however, is of much more importance than opulence, the act of navigation is perhaps the wisest of all commercial regulations of England. The question of did Smith support the Navigation Acts, I think, is a kind of important question, and it's a bit of a muddle, and you have to kind of, he seems to agree with it in some places, but disagree with other places. And this question of, well, what is the Navigation Act, and is it fulfilling what it's saying? But if you just look at the line, right, there's a kind of jokiness to it, right? As defense, however, is much more importance than opulence. The act of navigation, right, that thing that like, is so necessary for national defense that we're willing to put increased tariffs, is perhaps the wisest of all commercial regulations of England. It's like after he just like, had this whole section about like attacking these commercial regulations of England, the act of navigation is maybe the wisest of them all. So it's like kind of, it's got kind of here, like on the list. Yeah, I don't think it's a defense, and it's an exception, but how much Smith really supported this exception, was willing to fight for it, I don't think as much as people often make out to be. 2, to balance out the effect of a domestic tax on a home industry, right? So like there's a tax, say on a home industry, and well, like to be fair, like through the home industry, we're gonna like put a tariff on that foreign producers in that same industry. Now, this is not a protectionist argument. This is like some sort of sense of like balancing out policy and trying to be fair. It obviously raises the question of like, well, how do we need the domestic tax on the home industry? Like maybe we should lower it, and like so, it's a kind of intervention dynamic element at play here too. The third in the news is retaliatory tariffs. Yeah, so maybe if France puts a big tariff on England, maybe we should retaliate. He does a fair bit of equivocating. There's a sense that he's sort of saying, yes, in theory, this is a potential reason for import restraints. Like in modern parlance, like, yes, you can write down a model where there's some optimal level of an optimal retaliatory tariff. But Smith kind of goes on, like when the politics enters into the fray here, like they're going to disregard your model entirely. They're going to kind of disregard your exact specifications. So yeah, in theory, but probably not so much in practical politics. So it's by no means a kind of 100% endorsement of retaliatory tariffs. So yes, there are exceptions, but I'm not sure how big of a deal they are in actuality. Okay, so kind of the export side. I'm going to cover drawbacks and bounties. On drawbacks, which are repayments of import duties, goods are re-exported. The goal here is to kind of preserve competitiveness of domestic manufacturers in these sort of foreign markets. Smith is okay with this. He largely supports it. It removes distortions. The chapter on drawbacks, I think, is like 2 or 3 pages. So, on bounties, like totally against it, strongly critical, wasteful and distortionary. The sort of goal is like direct subsidies for exporting certain domestic goods. They encourage production beyond what's efficient or demanded, and they kind of lead to higher prices for consumers. They misallocate labor and capital. Like they mess with the sort of workings of the invisible hand. And Smith really pounds his fists on this. It's not only that, so he says both laws, like some laws related to the core laws, were evident violations of natural liberty and therefore unjust. And they were both, too, as impolitic as they were unjust. It is the interest of every society that things of this kind should never either be forced or obstructed. So it's like a kind of double whammy, right? It's a violation of natural liberty. You're like messing with other people, like get what you want done. So no. And then it's impolitic. Like the economics don't even work. So no. So he sort of really pounds his fist. There's a kind of real animation here. Kind of outside, maybe a kind of more cool, temperate, more analytical approach. Kind of building on this like idea, this kind of pounding of the fist, and I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier that there's another through line, which is Smith's system of natural liberty. He nicely sort of says in page 530, all systems, either of preference or of restraint, therefore, being thus taken away, the obvious and simple system of natural liberty establishes itself of its own accord. Every man, as long as he does not violate the laws of justice, is left perfectly free to pursue his own way. So after we get rid of all of these mercantilist interventions in the domestic and foreign trade, then the system of natural liberty establishes itself, and the invisible hand works, right? That's kind of the kind of core idea. Well, okay. Okay. So as we're kind of articulating this, right, the system of natural liberty and sort of advocating for less intervention, the question is, well, what does Smith want the state to do at all? And so kind of enters into what we now think of as a sort of political theorizing or like political economy. So in his system of natural liberty, the sovereign has 3 essential and limited duties. One is defense. The other is justice, a kind of internal night watchman functions, like police, fire, or something like that. Court system. Defense, the military, the army, the navy. Third is, it's like worth quoting in full. Thirdly, the duty of erecting and maintaining certain public works and certain public institutions, which it can never be for the interest of any individual or small number of individuals to erect and maintain, because the profit could never repay the expense to any individual or small numbers of individuals, though it may frequently do much more than repay it to a great society. Okay, that's kind of a long-winded duty. And I think of it as a kind of like erecting of public works and institutions, like public goods kind of question. This seems quite expansive, and I think if you were going to kind of read into it, you can really enlarge the sort of powers and size of the state. Whether or not one should do that is sort of a question that's up for debate in the sort of the public sphere. Smith has a presumption of liberty, a sort of a presumption away from expanding that set that we can kind of throw into the third bucket. Here's Jacob Viner in 1927, kind of articulating this, and there are others who sort of pick up on this and articulate it, but this is a great quote. There is no possible room for doubt, however, that Smith in general believed that there was, to say the least, a strong presumption against government activity beyond its fundamental duties of protection against its foreign foes and the maintenance of justice. So a sort of strong presumption against like throwing lots of things into this bucket of the third sort of essential duty. And this sort of comes across not just in these sort of paragraphs on on natural liberty, but sort of throughout the entire book. I think this is a kind of core theme of the entire book. One possible exception is his stuff on usury. Professor Jesus Fernandez Villaverde talked about usury yesterday, so I wanted to kind of get this in to kind of build on that. Most of Smith's exceptions to natural liberty, sort of like state intervention, involve status quo policies. So Smith supported, or seemed to support, I think, legal limits on the interest rates. His reasoning being a kind of, if you kind of know the modern econ lingo, sort of anticipates modern credit rationing, a la Stiglitz and Weiss. Like higher interest rates attract riskier and less credible borrowers, kind of like hucksters, as it were. Usury laws help direct capital toward more prudent and productive users. Right, the more prudent and productive user is not going to be taken by the high interest rates, the high potential, as it were. The aim is not really so much to suppress lending, but to kind of promote financial stability. Admittedly, his writing on the matter is quite odd and even contradictory, like in the same paragraph. So it's a bit of a muddle, actually, whether or not this is a kind of full-throated, like fully fleshed out defense of usury. It's worth noting that Jeremy Bentham, I think, kind of like forcibly and kind of pretty strongly rebuts Smith in 1787 in his defense of usury. And if I'm not mistaken, Smith's response is a kind of funny sending Bentham a copy of the Wealth or of the Theory of Moral Sentiments, kind of saying like, yeah, like you got me on that one. Go out and like look at my other book, and maybe you can find some other things to pick up on and improve. Sort of coming near the end, whenever we think about an 18th century thinker, I think today, naturally, we always want to know, well, what did he think about slavery and the slave trade? And Smith, I think, is a kind of great shining example. Here's Clarkson in 1808, after the abolition of the Slave Trade Act in 1807, saying, "It is a great honor to the University of Glasgow that it should have produced, before any public agitation of this question, 3 professors, all of whom bore their public testimony against the continuance of the cruel trade being the slave trade. Those 3 professors would be Francis Hutcheson, Adam Smith, and John Miller." He leaves out Hutcheson's teacher, Gershom Carmichael, so really it's 4, Clarkson, not 3. But this is a kind of the history of the kind of the ancestors of Smith are also kind of against the slave trade. So just kind of 2 key examples in his own work. TMS contains a sort of powerful and quite rousing and kind of marvelous and amazing condemnation of slavery and its brutality in part 5. It's worth like picking up and reading. And in The Wealth of Nations, he argues that slavery is economically inefficient because enslaved laborers have no incentive to do like hard work. Free labor is actually more productive and ultimately cheaper. And so abolishing the slave trade or slavery in general, I think would sort of spell the end of this horrible blight. I highlight this just because, well, kind of naturally ask these questions. Okay, and so that is all I have. I can't go any further. So, Fernando, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Jacob. So, as
Questions.
always, if you have any questions, please share them in the question prompt. So we already have a couple. So let's start with in order as they came. So the first one is basically about the context of Adam Smith. What was special about Scotland compared to other parts of Europe or compared to England? Well, why there?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's kind of like a huge question. Like one, okay, like I'm going to spin a theory. It has something to do with the 1707 Act of Union, I think. So I think when they unified, there's some sense that the kind of political questions turned like big, right? And now we have to grapple with like what does it mean to sort of now participate in this larger polity that has been historically quite successful, and we kind of have to work these things out. But also, in some sense, like the capital city of the nation moves right to London, and so the kind of vacuum, the intellectual and the talk of the town, as it were, kind of moves to the universities. That's a kind of a theory, but I don't know. That's a great question. Like, why the Scottish Enlightenment and what was going on at the time? No,
A
yeah.
related question about the network of scholars in the Scottish Enlightenment. How central was Adam Smith here? Would we be talking about the Scottish Enlightenment without Adam Smith?
Oh, that's a good counterfactual. Um, I don't think so. I don't think so. I'm not like I get if you were to say yes, that would sort of mean that one of his compatriots would have also not only made the defense sort of for or like made the attack on mercantilism, but also kind of articulated a kind of larger moral theory that sort of Smith is picking up on. So yeah, I don't think so. I don't think without Smith, I don't really think there is what we think of today as the Scottish Enlightenment. That's like I'm not saying there would be no great collection of thinkers, but like without Luther or Erasmus, is there really a Protestant Reformation? Not really, right?
So a question regarding Eli Heckscher's classification of mercantilism. Carl asks regarding point four, in which he talks about system monetary policy. Would they, I would say, mercantilists were concerned about the risk of inflation?
Were they? That's a good. I'm not an expert on that. I don't know actually. I really don't know. I mean, probably not. I don't think they were thinking in terms of that. Does anyone else know the answer to that? I don't know.
A follow up to that regarding.
It's worth like checking out the book though and like trying to figure that out. I wonder if Heckscher takes that up, and I just don't know.
Okay, let's move on. We have many questions. So another question about Adam Smith's theory of economic growth, given what you exposed about the pin factory. Did Adam Smith recognize the importance of technology in increasing economic growth?
That's a great question, and you can expand that to his question, like sort of discussions on innovation. I think they're like buried in the book. His question, points about technology or innovation, sort of development of that. But there is no, if I'm remembering correctly, like great chapter, as it were, a great book on the development of technology or of innovation. That's a kind of it's a kind of missing component that we look back on Smith. Not saying it's not there and worth piecing together, but he's not thinking in terms of like the way we think of it as growth theory.
Okay.
Also, this is the early days of the Industrial Revolution, I should add. So it's not like it's not like he can look back and say, look at the huge hockey stick, kind of like we can. Although it was budding.
So a follow-up to that question, we have two of them. Ignacio asks, what technology can be found between Smith's times with Industrial Revolution and today emergence of AI technology that can be translated to today's social work and economic changes?
Wait, what the question is, what technologies are sort of in
If there is a
between?
relation between today's reception of AI and his view on technology, I would say, yeah. And how, yeah.
Yeah, like I said, there's not like a great thing on that. Like to spin out one idea, and this is not really like a in Smith, but this might be like a Smithian take, is that AI, the development of AI, kind of like the development of the internet, is akin more to the printing press than really anything else. And so, not that this features quite prominently in three, but I think the printing press kind of kickstarts this sort of development of ideas, and it kind of bumps Europe kind of out of this feudal age. Yeah, look in book three. You should go check out book three. Maybe there might be something kind of in that vein.
Another question related to economic growth in Smith. So Marcus asks, why did he think that England and the Netherlands were more wealthy by the time he wrote Wealth of Nations?
Did Marcus ask that? Is
Yeah,
Shara?
yeah.
Um, one thing that is through this is just England and not the Netherlands. Obviously, the commercial element of both England and the Netherlands, and sort of they kind of great expansion of trade at the time is probably the first best answer. Another one would be, which is not, again, there's no chapter on this, but a kind of island thesis for Smith as well as Hume. Some sense that the island, like island geography, kind of primes England politically and economically to be dominant. That's a good question, Marcus.
Another question regarding other topic, which is Sam Smith and monetary theory. So an attendee asks about one of your slides, 25, in which I think you're quoting excess notes or something like that. And he asks if this is kind of the reflux theory, which usually is attributed to Fullerton. But why is that? Or is Smith the original creator of this theory?
You said 25.
25,
I
yeah.
just want to refresh my own. Come on. I don't know why my buttons don't work here. This is like a Larry White question. I wish Larry White was here. I don't know the answer to that question. You should prompt ChatGPT.
Okay.
I hate to say that, but I don't know.
Another attendee asks, in the current context, what would Smith say on what a state's policy on market freedom should be given that other states are not liable to follow the same?
You're kind of getting at the idea that, for example, I'm just going to assign like the United States is a kind of free market, but China is not. And so, like in the global international order or in the sort of global markets, China in some sense plays by different rules. Yeah, that's a great question. I think Smith obviously is like evident, like pro free market. This kind of comes up in questions about like, well, how does England deal with France? And like, given that we're at war with France, like, how do we deal with such questions? Those are complicated questions in 1776 as they are today. So I don't think Smith has like a kind of theory of like, oh, this is what you do when this happens. But if you kind of work through his exceptions, and particularly the one about defense, you kind of think about France and England or China and the United States. I think that's kind of the core of the answer. Does that make sense?
Jorge
It's
asks,
complicated. That's like that's the answer.
now we have a question by Jorge. He asks, nowadays there is a debate between people who believe the classical liberals were something close to libertarians, and there are others who defend they were pretty much social democrats. I guess
Yeah,
related to Smith, what's your
yeah.
stance on Adam Smith's position? Was he libertarian or was he social democrat?
I'm quite libertarian. Like so, those are my cards. And then I also think that Smith had a kind of what we might think of as a small L libertarian outlook, a kind of classical liberal outlook. I don't. Maybe to kind of push back on both. He was definitely not an anarchist. That's very clear. the state exists. We need to like think about operating within sort of confines of the nation state, and like we need to like get down to making good policy, right? So we're not an anarchist, or he's not an anarchist by any means. Wissy got kind of like on the left. I don't think so. That's not my read at all. I think to make that case, you would have to highlight his major exceptions to the liberty principle or the system of natural liberty. And my read is that most of them are status quo. Like it's just like, well, we have this thing, these usury laws, and like I'm like writing this humongous book about like attacking the mercantile system, and so I'm not gonna like wade into this, or like I'm gonna kind of punt a little bit on this. One piece of evidence, perhaps against that, is Smith never mentions the poor laws, and the poor laws are some of the most important laws, like like on the books at the time. Like it's kind of an open and big question for him. And in his questions of like, well, what should the sovereign do? He never mentions poor laws. You might say, well, like that's a tacit endorsement. Yeah, not really. I don't think so. So I would say Smith as libertarian is fine, at least for me. But there are good arguments on the other side.
Good. So going back to the question about Scottish Enlightenment, Biotri asks, was there anything about the culture and religious beliefs that precipitated the Scottish Enlightenment? I am trying to think more along the lines of what Max Weber says in the Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism.
Yeah, that's a great, yes. I think Luther and the Protestants, I guess, and Calvin as well, kind of open up the world and sort of morally authorize a whole host of careers and jobs that were once sort of off. One, like either the job was like off the table, or like it was just morally repugnant, or like the jobs that were on the table, like if your dad was like a weaver, like you had to be a weaver, like that's just like. And so the Protestant Reformation kind of opens that box up, and by the time we get to Smith sort of morally authorizes the kind of pursuit of honest income. You sort of see this with sort of the invisible hand theorizing, saying like, yeah, it's like okay to be a merchant. It's like it's okay to kind of follow your self-interest on these matters. One, you probably know it already, but Deirdre McCloskey has some great stuff on this. Yeah. So I don't think just that one more. I don't know if obviously the Presbyterian element of Scotland is important, but I think this sort of larger story about morally approving of merchant activity as well as just like kind of larger economic activity is part of the story of the Scottish Enlightenment.
So returning to the questions about Smith and the role of the state, Alfred asks, please address Smith's ideas on the government's responsibilities in providing public goods like infrastructure. Didn't Smith also recommend public schools to enlighten workers rendered dull by the division of labor in factories?
Yes, he did. That I once had a better answer to this, and now I'm losing it. Again, like many of his sort of affirmations of state intervention, it always is a little bit more complicated, and it's not abundantly clear that Smith is a kind of 100% endorsement of kind of government schools. But yeah, no, I should like. That's a good point. You're kind of pushing me on this. I should include a slide on that in the next. Yeah, I think it's more complicated than the kind of just full-throated. And this is related to the kind of left Smithian stuff of Smith, left, right, center, libertarian. His endorsements are not always as full-throated as maybe the kind of someone on the left would want.
Kwawabena asks, did Smith have anything to say about the effects of industrialization on the environment and whether natural capital is substitutable with man-made capital? I know, what's the role of what did Smith thought about pollution and things like that?
And you guys are really pushing. I don't know. My immediate reaction is like, not really. But it would be worth kind of searching and looking if Smith even has even a couple lines on this. I hate to pull you in, Fernando. Do you know the answer to that? That's a good question.
No, actually, I don't know. Maybe next lecture we're gonna ask Professor Darren Klein. So now he's prepared for the questions that he may receive as well. So I mean, we have a lot of questions regarding comparing Smith. What would Smith thought about today's problem? So one of those questions
Yeah,
from
bring it
Maria
on.
says, "Do you think that continued defense spending should continue to be a priority for most countries when it comes to importing today?"
Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, it's the role of defense spending. Should that be
Okay.
kind of an important aspect to define basically trade policy? Like that's a reasoning for to limit imports.
I mean, it's clearly done, right? I mean, there's questions of the Jones Act. That is a kind of, I guess that's not defense spending. But in theory, yeah, it's not off the table. The question is of political prudence. I hesitate to like, sometimes I think it's difficult to parse out like what Smith is saying, what I'm saying. So like, I don't want to like give you my take on that as and then like repeat it as if Smith. But yeah, no, it's not off the table. Like
Now
it's
going
like
back
a
to
priority or something.
Smith and his network of ideas, Marcelo asks about an accusation done by Murray Rothbard, which says that Adam Smith stole or allegedly stole plagiarized ideas from predecessors such as Hutchinson. So, what do you think about this accusation?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't. I think. Yeah, I don't like. I'm not super well read on it, but I'm not inclined to go in that direction. I often find that most of what I find most valuable in Smith, and that's TMS and Wealth of Nations, is not perhaps what Murray found most valuable in Smith. In terms of like the Blackboard economics part, is interesting and it's worth reading and worth like studying, obviously. But I don't think it's Smith's most valuable contributions.
Ignacio asks about Smith's thinking about tariff retaliation and if it is related to our own current understanding of game theory. So, do you think that Smith influenced the idea of game theory, the development of game theory?
Probably. I mean, like, yeah, probably. Like on that particular issue, I don't know. I like, are there? Yeah, I don't probably, but I don't know on that particular issue. I do think one thing that comes like on that topic particularly, I think it's related to what the point that Smith is making on the retaliatory tariffs is like, yeah, you can like work out the game theory and write down the model, but once you hand it over to the politicians, it's cool. Like you're not taking in the public choice elements. So I think if we're going to draw the line from that discussion to modern day economics, it's probably more on the public choice side.
Alvaro asks, was Smith's theory sufficient enough to influence Karl Menger and his doctrine on political economics? Or was Menger creative enough to interpret free market and liberalism in a new way? So the core question that he's asking is, would Adam Smith be totally aligned with Karl Menger when he issued his first publication on political economy? So what was the relation between Menger, or what
Yeah,
was the relation between Smith and
Nathan Menger.
marginal economics? Yeah.
Yeah, Menger was quite a fan, from what I know of Smith. Obviously, the kind of stuff on the stuff on markets is very Smithian. Von Bobberk as well. Like you kind of also kind of get this sense, and they're kind of developing and working it out and like making it what we might think of as like more analytical or more modern in that sense. Obviously, the marginalism is like that's an innovation, but an appreciation for an understanding of markets, an appreciation for the workings of the invisible hand. That's Smith for sure. Like, I don't know. Could Menger have gotten there without Smith? Maybe, I don't know. Probably not. I don't know.
So Carlos
But I
has a
think Menger is like just as important. Yeah, he's a great thinker and just as important.
Carlos has a question in Spanish, so I will translate it.
Okay.
So I mean, it's a long one, so I'll try to summarize it a little bit. He more or less asks that what's the is free markets opposed given rentist opportunities, or what's the reason of why free markets are opposed given the reasoning provided by Adam Smith? So why is that the case that there are imports even if there is no rationale for it?
Two reasons. Public choice elements, right? There are winners and losers. Like, there are people who benefit from restrictions on importation, and the market for ideas is not efficient. There are lots of bad ideas out there, and even if Smith can smash them, it doesn't necessarily mean they go away.
Raymond asks about what was Sam Smith's vision on monopolies. Did he propose any way to prevent them?
That's also another good question. You guys are really pushing me. I like this. Smith in general does not have much or many good things like explicitly like in the text, as it were, like positive about what we think of as like firms. I don't think he was like a proponent or like an advocate for these huge English monopolies. So no. Related, I've been thinking more about the previous question, and I had a point, but it's lost me. Oh, yeah. In some sense, mercantilism or like, anti-free trade ideas are like a dead horse, and every generation economists need to like beat it. Like, there is some like sense that, or like some folk knowledge, folk wisdom that brings out these mercantilist ideas. Why? I don't know. It has something to do with this human psyche or something like that. Like,
so Jocelyn asks, and I'm going to paraphrase here a little bit about perhaps what Adam Smith thought about gender economics, or what was the role of women according to him. This is given that they produce a lot, but it does not go to the market. So, but they still produce labor, but it is basically not
yeah,
valued by the market.
the idea that like national income, as it were, doesn't include housework or things like that. What did Smith think about that? I don't know. That's another good question. Smith was certainly quite egalitarian in terms of like social relations. Egalitarian, I would assume that would then like kind of blow into kind of more egalitarianism in terms of gender relations. But how that influences his economics, I don't know that it does, or that he was thinking about such questions.
So one last question. Angel asks about Adam Smith and the role of the English colonies. So given that the Wealth of Nations was published more or less around the same time as the American Revolution, so what did he think about it? What did he thought about? What did he think about the America's independence and the role of the British and things like that?
Yeah, this is another big question. One that Dan, I think, can speak to better. I think I got the core of it. It's let him go. Like, it would just be better off without him. I don't mean that like derogatory. I mean like let him do their thing.
Okay, great. So, I mean, we just have a lot of questions. So we will continue basically developing this idea, because next session on Thursday will be by Daniel Klein. He will explain a little bit more about the relation between Adam Smith, the economist, and Adam Smith, the philosopher, and the whole system of presumption of liberty. So thank you for coming, and please tune in for the next session, which again, Professor Daniel Klein, a professor of economics at GMU, which we will be happy to hear him. And thank you, Jacob. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Appreciate the questions and listening.
I want to stop recording.